If you cold crash your beer, meaning drop the temperature of the beer after fermentation to a few degrees above freezing, what's the best way to do it? Chill it as quickly as possible or take a slow approach, dropping only a few degrees at a time? Well, there's some evidence that thermal shock caused by rapidly cooling can affect head retention. So to find out, I'm brewing two beers, one cold crashed rapidly and the other gradually, and seeing what effect that has on the head retention of those beers. This episode is sponsored by Great Fermentations. More on them in a bit. So I had somebody hit me up and ask me about running an experiment. You may have heard of him.
Hi, I'm John Palmer, the author of How to Brew.
And what did John want to test?
One question I've had for several years now is the effect of crash cooling on a beer.
Yes, the cold crash. I think most of us do one these days. So after fermentation has ended, but before packaging, a cold crash will drop the temperature of the finished beer to a few degrees above freezing. During the cold crash, the lower temperatures cause proteins, yeast and other particulates to settle out of suspension. That typically leads to clearer beer, but John wonders if cold crash could be contributing to another problem.
You may have noticed, as I have, that several commercial beers will have poor head retention in their lagers, and sometimes poor head retention in their other beers as well. And I think it stems from the word and the practice of crash cooling after fermentation. We've read in various books that cooling rate and thermal shock can have an effect on yeast, and it's been my understanding that the thermal shock, the rapid cooling of yeast, can cause them to excrete protective lipids from inside the yeast cell, and that those lipids can then affect the head retention of the beer. A lipid is a wax or wax-like substance. It's a group of compounds that includes waxes, oils, and fatty acids. So these essentially act as wetting agents and help collapse foam, even though that's not their purpose. They're a nutritional thing for the yeast cell. So I wanted to check this theory and how big of an effect does cooling rate have on head retention.
Well, John, let's find out. So step one, we need some beer. Now, while we could have conducted this experiment with just about any beer style, John and I both like the idea of brewing a West Coast IPA. Starting with reverse osmosis water, this is going to be a 10-gallon batch. I have about 13 3/4 gallons of water. To that I'm going to add my water salts. Give those a stir in. And this heavily flavours sulfates over chloride. We want to do that because this is going to be such a hoppy beer and we really want to accentuate that. So to my reverse osmosis water, I added 16 grams of gypsum, 5 grams of calcium chloride, and 8 grams of Epsom salt. Oh, now to add the grains. This is just pale malt. I'm using foundation malt from Epiphany Craft Malts, and I'm also using wheat malt from Epiphany Craft Malt as well. I'm using 22 pounds of foundation and 4 pounds of wheat malt. So that's an 85%, 15% split. Yeah, and there's not much colour to be gained from those two malts. So you can see this is a very white, milky consistency in a mash. Kind of already looks like we've got some head retention on this thing. Okay, and I'm going to get this back up to 152 Fahrenheit, that's 67 Celsius. Mash for an hour. After the hour elapsed, I used my pulley to remove the grains from the wort. Highly recommended with 10-gallon batches. Then it was time to move on to the important business of feeding this IPA some hops. Now, as for hop additions for this beer, I'm using C hops, so I'm using CTZ, Chinook and Cascade. And here's what I'm doing in the boil. So for my 60-minute addition, I'm using CTZ. I'm adding 25 grams in at the start of the boil. Then at 15 minutes, I'm making a second addition. There's 30 grams each of Cascade and CTZ going in there. And then at 0 minutes, so at flame out, I'll be adding 40 grams each of Cascade and Chinook. Looks like I'm just reaching boil now. So let's start with CTZ. Set a timer for 1 hour. After adding my 15-minute and 0-minute hop addition, I rapidly chilled the wort and saw that I'd reached an original gravity of 1.066 right on target. From there, I split the batch across 2 different fermenters. And into those fermenters, I'm going to be adding my yeast. That is Flagship, this is A07. I'm going to be adding this into both of the fermenters and then fermenting at 68 Fahrenheit or 20 Celsius. And once fermentation gets most of the way done, there's one thing more I'll need to do, and that's to dry hop. Now, before we get to dry hopping, cold crashing, and checking on the head retention of these 2 beers, a quick word about today's sponsor, Great Fermentations. Family owned and operated for more than 25 years, Great Fermentations offers a huge range of brewing supplies and equipment. Great Fermentations are well known for their top-notch customer service, which I can personally attest to. I bought my very first brewing system from these guys, and even though I was a complete novice, their helpful expertise got me up and running in no time. Great Fermentations offers the ability to custom build your malt bills in fractional amounts, so you're not forced to order full pound increments when you only need half or quarter pound of something. And shipping is free on most orders over $59. Check them out at greatfermentations.com. Alright, let's fast forward a couple of days to the dry hop. It's been about 5 days since brew day. Airlock activity is still going, but barely, which means fermentation is almost done, so that's when I'm going to add in my dry hops. I've put them in these little French press baggies, and in here I have 60 grams of Cascade and 60 grams of Chinook. In they go. So fast forward a couple more days, and it's time to get down to the variable. I asked John to explain what's going on during the cold crash and how I should conduct mine.
Essentially, after fermentation, after maturation, the yeast are ready to flocculate. They've done their job, and to clarify the beer, cooling it down to near freezing, it encourages the yeast to flocculate. They clump together, they settle out. The colder temperatures encourage haze, active proteins, and polyphenols to clump together and also agglomerate and fall faults at the bottom. So a cold temperature helps clarify the beer before packaging. And of course, from a commercial brewery's point of view, time is money. So the faster they can cool a beer and from fermentation and move it on to packaging, the better. But various brewers over the years have, and yeast people have said that thermal shock can be an issue. So thus the recommendation in How to Brew, and I believe in the yeast book as well, for gradual cooling. 3 degrees Celsius every 12 hours as a recommended maximum cooling rate.
All right, 3 degrees C every 12 hours. Well, first thing I needed to do was to change my temperature controllers from the barbaric measurement of Fahrenheit to the scientific clarity of Celsius. Then I dropped the temperature of one fermenter by just 3 degrees from 20 to 17 C, and the second one I dropped down, way down, to 3 C. Now, these temperature controllers are hooked up to a glycol system, and that cools my wort pretty rapidly. And for the cold crash, I did make sure to add a little bit of pressure to both fermenters to counter the effect of any negative pressure buildup. I noted that by 8 PM, both beers were close to target temperature. So it looks like I've got a new 8 o'clock routine. It's 8 AM the next day now. I'm actually brewing a beer, but I'm also going to be dropping the temperature another 3 degrees. And so this continued, dropping one fermenter by 3 degrees while the other remained at 3 Celsius. To be honest, this got old real fast. If this works, I'm going to want to find a way to automate it. But eventually, the 2 fermenters reached parity and my 8 o'clock routine was no more. A day later, I performed a closed transfer, moving the beer from each fermenter into a CO2 purged keg, and took final gravity readings to find both beers had reached 1.006. I then force carbonated each beer by adding 40 psi of pressure and left the beers in my fridge overnight. Next day, I used the pressure relief valve to reduce the CO2 down to serving pressure. At last, it was time to test head retention. Alright, so for this test, I've got fast and slow here with corresponding kegs. Both kegs have about 6 psi of pressure, and then I'm using these to serve the beer. This is probably going to come out quite foamy, but that'll be an interesting experiment to see how long that foam takes to die out. Let's do it. So clearly the serving pressure is way too high here, resulting in massive amounts of foam in both pours. The fast crash beer retained a bit more foam initially, and things stayed that way, although both beers held up quite well. I left the beers for a full 12 minutes. By then, there was still a trace of foam on the fast crash beer and noticeably more lacing as well. Round 1 to the fast cold crashed beer. But I wasn't done yet. So I want to try a second test. I've lowered the PSI, the serving pressure, to just about 2 PSI now. So there should be a much less foamy pour. Let's see what difference we get from that. Now, these beers poured much better, and the head retention, well, that held up pretty well with both. There was a thick layer of foam that seemed quite happy to hang around for a little while. After 12 minutes, most of the foam had dissipated in both beers, but there were some notable differences. This time it was the slow crash beer exhibiting better head retention, although not by a huge amount. The lacing also appeared a touch denser with the slow cold crashed beer. But probably the biggest difference, that was in beer clarity. The slow cold crash beer was noticeably brighter. You can clearly see those CO2 bubbles rising to the surface, while the fast crash beer retains a touch of haze. Now, at this point I thought I was done, but actually, well, I just left the beers out while I was cleaning up, and you can see now that on the fast cold crash, the head is almost completely gone. But on the slow cold crash, the head has persisted. You can almost not see the beer at all because of the foam. This is after about 20 minutes. So there is a clear difference here between fast and slow.
Well, that's interesting. So it does appear to be a factor, but not as dramatic a factor as I've seen in several competitions that I've judged. You know, where a beer is poured, has great head at pouring, but rapidly collapses and goes away. So that by the time you've gone past, smelling the aroma, checking the color, and ready to start drinking it, it's a flat surface.
So that addresses visual differences, but are the beers perceptively different in other ways? Remember that John said rapid cooling of the beer results in a thermal shock that can cause the yeast to excrete protective lipids, essentially waxes, oils, and fatty acids. Will that result in beers that taste or smell different depending on how rapidly the beers were cooled? Well, it's time for triangle tests. Participants received 1 cup where the beer was cold crashed rapidly and 2 cups where the beer was cold crashed by 3 degrees Celsius every 12 hours and asked to distinguish the unique sample. And first up, taking the test 5 times, was a rather skeptical participant. Going into this, I basically think I got no chance. I'm not expecting to be able to pass this. I mean, as for how these beers turned out, I'm pretty pleased. This is a really drinkable West Coast IPA. To me, the green one tastes a good bit hoppier, so I'm going to just go right out and say green is the odd one out.
No.
What was it?
No.
He's just straight in, like, no, he's got it wrong again. Off into the next one. Okay. There's a nice little bite on the finish to these. A little bit of sweetness too. Green is the odd one out. That's right. Yes! Okay. Let's keep going. All of this foam doesn't make it too easy to pick up much on the aroma. Blue. Red is the odd one out.
Nope.
Go blue for my final guess.
Green.
It's green. Well, yeah, I'm not surprised. I was guessing every time. I am not reliably able to distinguish these beers. But what about tasters blinded to the variable? I served the beer to 20 participants. A total of 11 tasters would have to accurately identify the unique sample in order to reach statistical significance. And a total of 9 did, indicating participants were unable to distinguish a difference. Cold crash speed did not appear to make a notable sensory difference with this beer. But as for visual difference, that did seem to get more pronounced the longer the beer spent in the glass.
This is over an hour.
Yeah, nice.
Still got like,
Yeah,
I mean-
still got a fresh head and looks great.
I really didn't want this to work, to be honest, because I wanted it to be the quick and easy. I just press a button on my controller one time and not worry about it. But I'm kind of thinking I'm going to have to try this at least one more time now to see if I get the same clear, fizzy result. Damn you. I didn't want this.
Well, good. I got to stay employed somehow.
Now, a quick addendum to this. This is about a month later. I tried this process again of 3 degrees of cooling every 12 hours on the next beer that I brewed, and well, check out the result. This is after 15 minutes of the beer being in the glass, and there is still this thick, persistent head on top of the beer, that wonderful layer of foam. And it stayed for the entire time I was drinking this beer, maybe 20 or 25 minutes. So that really proves to me that there is something going on here, and well, I'm convinced I'm going to be making this a part of my standard process for the next few beers going forwards and seeing if I continue to get such good results. So thank you, John, for bringing this one to me. It has been a fun one. And another conversation I had with John Palmer was about mash length and what happens if you don't mash for 60 minutes. And you can see that video right here.